I would like to welcome you. It's a special privilege and honor to have with us the 29th Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, Dr. Kevin Hassett, for discussion of the President's economic agenda, and I suspect it'll involve a very non-controversial matter of tax reform. It is especially meaningful for me and the ACCF because we're privileged to have 5 former chairmen of the CEA on our Board of Scholars, and now we are so lucky and honored to have a former ACCF scholar as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. It's a special moment for us too because Kevin and I went to the same college, Swarthmore College, and I'm not being paid by the Alumni Association, but Greg Mankiw had a study which showed that per capita we produce more PhD economists than any other university. As a matter of fact, there are 3 Swarthmorites. There is obviously Kevin Hassett, who graduated with honors. I sort of stumbled.
High honors.
High honors, high honors, forgive me.
Get it right.
Get it right. I sort of stumbled through and sort of graduated with dishonor, which is the difference. But what's also fascinating, we have Paige, who is now in your office, who also graduated. So there are 3 sort of Swarthmorites in this area. And at the risk of getting in trouble, obviously Kevin graduated with highest honors, I with lowest honors, but I think our real future is in Paige.
It's true.
So the other thing I would say is that the good news is that Kevin actually got his PhD, he got his degree in economics from Swarthmore 3 years before the passage of the Tax Reform Act of 1986, which is good because he anticipated and got ready for the needed reform which we're about to have. Some people say that I graduated way back when it started in 1913, but I checked, and I was 4 years old when we did the 54 Act, which is a big one. But the important news is that Kevin prepared for this tax reform. The other sort of thing I'd like to throw out is that I, unfortunately, when I went to Swarthmore, got it all wrong. I read the wrong textbook, Bob Samuelson, and now they tell me there's a better one. I can't do numbers. Remember, Moynihan said that he's a qualitative guy as opposed to a quantitative guy, this regression analysis, and we had the 4 trend cards and all of this. And finally, I figured it out when I read a book that said Harry Truman gave up and he said he needed a 2-handed economist. And I assure you that we have a 2-handed economist here, one of the best economists in the country, and the president of the country is privileged to have you at the helm.
It's pretty kind. Thanks a lot.
So I think what we're going to do, I think Kevin agreed to it. It works best if we have a question and answer. And I think, Kevin, you might want to make a few comments, and then we'll just open it up to the press, if that's agreeable to you.
Oh, sure, yeah. And you know, thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. I was on the Board of Scholars for probably about 20 years, I guess maybe. It seems about right. But I can remember you know, reading ACCF studies back when I was even in grad school, that you've been out there at the forefront of thinking about tax reform for as long as I've been paying attention to it. I think that, you know, the thing that we've been working on the most in the last few months has been tax reform, that it's really close to the finish line. Secretary Mnuchin and I were joking in the Roosevelt Room at a tax meeting a couple days ago that it's the time right now to just hand the ball to Marshawn Lynch. We don't really want to run a pass play right now, but we're very hopeful that this thing will get into the end zone sometime soon, and quite confident that it'll be a big plus for the economy. So we're happy to talk about whatever people want to talk about, of course, but tax reform is front and center on all of our minds. The one thing I can say is that the thing that I think might be underappreciated about the way the tax reform has gone is that the president was really insistent from the beginning that it be regular order, that you know, that our vision be there at the beginning and our non-negotiables kind of on the table, but then Congress is to do its work through regular order, that they should argue about it. They each come, into the room with a different sense about how to trade off equity versus efficiency, and what rate they want and what fairness and redistribution would make them want to vote for the bill. And that process, I think, has worked out really well. If you look at, I know that there have been a lot of stories about, oh, this guy's going to destroy the bill, we're not going to vote for the bill because of this or that. But I think that all of that is the way our founding fathers thought it should happen. And I think that process is still going on. And so one thing I would just ask about the questions is that, I'm not here to put my finger on the scale for something that's being disputed between the House and the Senate right now, that we've been respectful of the legislative process from the beginning, and we're going to continue to be. And if someone up there wants to ask us, well, what about this, what about that, we of course have those conversations, but it's not something that I'm not going to break news about a White House position on something that's being negotiated in Congress. And so if we do have questions, then please, you could ask the question, but I'm not going to, I'm not going to be very helpful, I think, if you do.
Kevin, if I could, also we have 4 sponsors of this event. Rob Nichols here from the American Bankers Association, then we have the American Beverage Association, we have NAREIT, and then we have Prudential. And more importantly, for me, maybe not for you, I've almost got my full board here, and that's important because they can determine if I can continue to work or not. So I appreciate it. Who would like to ask the first question? Please identify yourself, sir.
Oh, there's a mic coming for you, Mark, there, just so others can hear you. Yeah.
No, good morning. Thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Johansson. I work for Boeing, and of course we're thrilled with potential gains, especially the favorability for global companies through this tax bill. Just wanted to ask you, it appears that the economy is really roaring. The stock market is reaching new highs. They seem to be anticipating a very good return on what the administration is doing with the economy. Could you kind of just address yourself to the current situation, GDP growth, et cetera, just your perspective?
Sure, and I think that it is actually a nice backdrop to think about as we think about the impact of tax reform going forward. That you kind of course, want to know what the setting is that we're putting the tax reform into. And if we were in a recession right now, then I think that we would model the effects of the tax reform quite a bit differently. And so it is a good place to start the conversation. Thanks for the question. The President tweeted our analysis of the most recent third quarter GDP release. The career staff at CEA has been following closely the hurricanes. Even like while the hurricanes are happening, because the CEA is just about one of the larger organizations within a White House. We do a lot of data analysis. We tend to, in the Houston floods, we had sort of real-time flood data that we were merging with Zillow and other real estate data so that we could actually see like how much water was affecting each house. And so when we were putting out estimates of the damage, they were based on a lot of data analysis. And that same team says that if you exclude the negative effects of the hurricane, because a lot of economic activity stopped, refineries closed, restaurants weren't open for a while, the third quarter GDP was pretty close to 4%. And the interesting thing about hurricane effects on quarterly growth is that there tends to be a sort of a rebound that can be quite large and that isn't necessarily good news in the sense that if you break a window and then you replace the window, then it shows up as GDP when you're putting the window in. So the point is just that fourth quarter probably will have more growth because of the hurricane, not less. And so we are going into next year with a good deal of momentum that's probably averaged over the last 3 quarters of the year at around 3%. I think that the first 3% quarter we have to underweight a little bit because there were some weird weather things in the first and second quarter that made the first quarter lower and the second quarter higher. But the fact is that we're going in at about 3%, and we're doing that from a position of a long, slow recovery that has driven the sort of top line unemployment rate down close to what economists think of as being full employment. And so in U.S. history, what typically happens is that if a recovery keeps going at this kind of late date in the recovery, then you start to see a lot of progress made on income inequality. You start to see people who have been separated from the workforce re-enter. And low and moderate income people see their wages, people are competing for them more, and they see their wages go up more. And so if you think back to the times when we've made a lot of progress, the economy's made a lot of progress on income inequality, it's tended to be at times when labor markets are tight, and then wages start to pop because of it. And you can definitely see pockets of the country where this stuff is happening. That Colorado has about half an unemployed worker per job listing. And so, if you look at wage growth out there, then you can really start to see it happening. And so against that backdrop, if we insert this tax reform now, then we have to and think about the effects on the typical American family, American worker. That if we acknowledge that process, we can see that what usually happens in the recovery is that when the unemployment rate's 8%, then if a firm wants to expand, then it's really easy to find a worker. And so they bring in a worker. But now, if you want to expand, and I think with the growth numbers that we talked about, firms are really going to want to expand. They're going to want to bring their activity home from abroad, and so on. Then you really have to increase the productivity of your workers by investing in capital deepening at your firm. And so precisely at the moment where I think that social justice arguments would imply that it's really crucial that the recovery continue, because this is the point in economic history where we usually make a lot of progress, to have a big reduction in the tax on capital formation is a recipe for really healthy wage growth. And so, I think that people will see the first glimpse of the tax cuts if they pass after the withholding tables change, probably maybe by February. Everybody's take-home pay is going to go up. But the second round is going to be all the capital formation that comes home that's going to precisely at the right time in economic history drive up productivity and wage growth. Are you going to be the one who calls?
Yeah, why don't I, because, sir, could you please identify yourself?
Arthur Weiss, American University. Yes, I would be interested to hear how you see trade policy evolving in the administration. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So it's interesting to wind back and mention what the role of the Council of Economic Advisors is. It was created in the 1946 Employment Act, I think as part of a kind of retrospective on the Depression and what could have been done better. And it's really a special privilege to be there and an honor to participate in what the CEA does, which is provide objective advice to the president on the economic impact of the decisions that he has to make. And it's a very unusual design for a large government agency in that just about everybody at CEA is a professor on leave from someplace for a year or two. And I'm happy to report that even though things being the way they are, that my confirmation took a little longer than it has for other CEA chairs because confirmations were moving slower, that we were able to recruit a big group of economists from the University of Tennessee, from Texas Tech. We've got 2 people from Oxford who provide objective advice to the president. And so if there's an economic principles meeting, then the CEA chair is there doing that. And so while I don't have any authority over regulatory policy or trade policy, that I've been participating, since I've been there in the discussions. And, I think that the president's right that if you look at our trade deals, that we've made a lot of pretty strange deals. Erwin Stelzer, an old friend of mine from the American Enterprise Institute, wrote a really interesting column a couple of weeks ago about just how U.S. autos sold in China are treated versus how Chinese autos sold in the U.S. would be treated, and the asymmetry of that. And I think that there's a lot of hope that moving towards reciprocity, moving towards more symmetrical trade deals could be a big plus for the economy. I think that there's a lot of stuff ongoing, a lot of policies, a lot of attempts to make things more symmetrical. And I think that the idea that removing distortions would be a positive isn't really controversial amongst economists.
Let me see, the media, who are you?
Mark.
So I wanted to ask, I know at Cato last week you had expressed that the president would be really unhappy with raising the corporate tax rate from 20%, and then over the weekend he expressed more of an openness to potentially raising it to 22. And so I wanted to ask what was behind kind of the thinking, why did he maybe ease his stance in that regard? And are there certain things he'd be more willing to trade to raise that corporate rate, SALT deductions or bringing back some of those or some other changes?
I think that the president has spoken for himself on these things, and he's acutely aware of how important marginal tax rates are, and also, I guess, acutely aware that in a conference that sometimes things move around, and I think everybody in the White House is cognizant of the fact that there are things that they are working on repairing, like maybe the AMT stuff, that might require revenue from a different source, and we don't want to get out in front of that process. But I think that the kind of trade-off that the president talked about is the kind of thing that if we modeled it, if there are rates, income tax rates that are changing and corporate tax rates that are changing, then it's not necessarily undermining the positive economic effect of the bill, because you've got two ends moving. And so the president has said what he said, and I think that's cognizant of the process that's ongoing, and the fact that some of these parameters might now, close to the end zone, have to be moved.
Kevin, one of the interesting things that as I've followed you in recent weeks is, tell us about the tax policy view of the leftist government of Greece, where they are on corporate tax rates, and also the glorious French. I think they also understand that we need to get corporate rates down.
I think or the OECD, I'm privileged to be the chair of the Economic Policy Committee at the OECD, and my chief of staff, who many of you know, DJ Norquist, who's here in the front row, and I just ran a meeting in Paris where people who have a job kind of like mine in governments all around the world, where there was nobody who disputed the idea that there's significant positive growth effects of corporate tax. And there was kind of, I think, at the OECD meeting, a kind of widespread sense of relief that the U.S. was entering the community of nations by having a corporate tax system that was kind of up to industry standards. And so, yeah, I think that it's about time that we get the corporate tax policy fixed here in the U.S. It's something that international bodies, nonpartisan bodies, have been calling for a long time. And I'm kind of surprised that it's viewed as a controversial thing in any quarter here in the U.S.
And obviously, President Obama called for a lower corporate rate.
28% rate,
Yeah.
that's right.
Who wants to come next? We have got the media again, and a top dog there. Who are you again?
Paul Beckett from the Wall Street Journal. Thank you very much.
Bureau chief, too.
Thank you, Mark. Could you talk a little bit about post-tax reform? There's obviously a lot of interest in welfare reform and infrastructure, which are two priorities that have been set out. Could you map those out for us a little bit, assuming that tax reform is wrapped up in the schedule that you've discussed?
Yeah, sure. The White House has been working on lots of different policies since I've been there, including welfare reform and infrastructure. And so it's not the case that we've been 100% focused on tax, across the entire staff, and now the whole entire staff is going to move over and focus on this or that. There's been a lot of work on what an infrastructure bill might look like next year, and also what welfare reform steps we could take. I don't have any news to make, sorry, on that, but the president has said that those things are next up, perhaps welfare first, and I'm sure you'll have lots of stuff to write about someday soon, because it's been pretty advanced in the process.
A competitor, right? And you are from the Hill? What's your name?
Hi, Nate.
I just wanted to ask you, it seems like poll after poll shows that the public doesn't support the tax bill. Many people think that their own taxes will go up, and they view this as something that will mostly benefit like corporations and the wealthy. I wanted to see if you had any thoughts as to why the polls aren't, looking good for you guys, and if you think that the public will be won over, if you guys are concerned about these at all.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'm not an expert on polls, and I have, seen Kellyanne talk about it with me a little bit, and I think that one of the problems with polls, and that's true in the tax space too, is that exactly how you word the question has a big impact on the way people respond. And so if you ask the question, how do you feel about a big tax cut for the rich, then people tend to respond negatively. But if you say, do you think that we should make the U.S. more competitive, then people would respond favorably and so on. And so I for one don't show up every day and wonder about how are we going to move the polls. And I think that for tax reform, the poll that mattered is that the American people knew that President Trump wanted to do this, and they voted for him. And as a scholar of tax policy, I was taking Alan Auerbach's class at the University of Pennsylvania on taxes in graduate school in 1986. The thing I can tell you that the 86 Act is kind of an exception, that most of the time big policy changes happen when a president runs for office with an agenda, and then is elected, and then feels that he has a mandate to pursue that agenda. And I think the fact that President Trump was elected and had talked a lot about a tax reform like the thing that we're doing means that that's sort of the normal historical process that we're seeing right now. And I think that if the American people didn't want a big tax reform, then they would have voted for Mrs. Clinton more than they did.
How about if we just step aside from these questions, which are very timely, to a broader one? I read with great interest your comments at TPC about Arthur Oken and the buckets and inefficiency versus equality. I think that for those who don't know that, I think that would be a nice...
Oh, sure. Well, yeah. Arthur Oken was a CEA chair. He's, probably, not to diminish the others, the greatest, and a person who really should still be with us. He died an untimely death in his early 50s of a heart attack, I guess. But we miss him. He's a thought leader, and his book, it's Equality and Efficiency,
yes.
The big trade-off.
Yeah, the trade-off.
Equity and efficiency. That it's what everybody who studies economics should start with when they're thinking about tax policy. And the idea is that a wealthy society needs to pay close attention to the welfare of those who are less well off, but that when you move resources to them, then in a bucket, then inevitably there are leaks in the bucket. If you have a really high marginal tax rate on business income, because businesses are owned by wealthy people, then you're going to diminish business activity, and that efficiency loss is something that is the trade-off for redistribution. And I think that thinking rationally about the distributional impact of tax policy is something that Oken taught us it's really, really important to do. And in my remarks at the Tax Policy Center, I was just saying that I thought that that in some quarters it seems like we've wandered into this world where we can ignore the leaks in the bucket and just focus only on static scores of changes in marginal rates. And I think that that's not appropriate. And I think that if you go back even to my opening discussion of this sort of crucial moment in economic history where wage growth normally would start to pick up, and that if we have a big stimulus of capital formation at this time, it'll have a big effect on inequality, that's an example of the way that I think that Art Oken would want us to discuss these issues.
And for the media table there, don't worry about cost of capital calculations. Just remember, their buckets do leak, and those who don't think there's an impact on growth don't understand that buckets are leaking. You, sir, are?
I'm Steve Matthews with Bloomberg.
Oh, hey, Steve.
You mentioned the corporate AMT fix. The Senate bill, I believe, has corporate AMT at 20%. Is that a problem?
I think that's something for them to work out, but I've been reading Bloomberg and Wall Street Journal about what's going on, just as you have.
Yes, I think we've got a regional media here. Are you from a salt state or not?
Not. Deborah Saunders with the Las Vegas Review-Journal. I'm thinking of my year-end story. So what are the 3 most important things that you think President Trump has done to stimulate the economy?
Oh, sure, thanks. And formerly of San Francisco, you're right, that different, yes. I think that the economy is picking up in part because there are tailwinds of the global economy. If you look at the EU has ratcheted up their growth forecast, the OECD has ratcheted up their growth forecasts, but I think that a lot of the growth that we talked about that we see this year is attributable to things that the president has already done. I think that the first thing, and you can see that in the business confidence, the first thing that has had an immediate effect is deregulation. And I think that deregulation sort of can come at the economy 2 ways. One is you take old regulations and rewrite them, something that's been aggressively pursued by this administration, and then that sort of removes a straitjacket on growth. But the second thing that you can do is just slow the creation of new regulations, and that's something that's also happened. And I think that if we were running a business, then if the government suddenly gave us a new regulation that we had to adhere to, then we'd have to hire lawyers and study, well, how are we going to do this? And it can be really quite costly and distracting for businesses to respond to new regulations. And I think that the fact that new regulations have slowed down to almost zero, and that's taken a lot of pressure off of businesses. Doug Holtz-Eakin's think tank put out a study last summer that said already by the summer 6 million fewer man hours were spent complying with new regulations. And so I think, so thing one is I think that deregulation is one reason why I think that confidence is so high. I think that thing two is the aggressive pursuit of tax reform has clearly been factored into markets. I think if you cut the corporate rate a good deal, then that has an impact on the after-tax cash flow for firms. And I think that the reduction of the corporate rate is probably priced about 80% into markets now, something like that. And that that anticipatory effect, I think, began when it became clear maybe a few months ago that this tax bill was really serious. But I think that those are the two big things that have happened this year. And so we could start to go through the next set of things that the president's done. But I think I'd stop with two.
That one of the founders of the American Council for Capital Formation, an early board member, was Murray Wiedenbaum. Mm-hmm. And for those who don't know, but Murray Wiedenbaum did some of the first cost-benefit analysis of regulations. And at one of our salons, I brought his first book, which was about this thin in terms of regulations and where we are now. And I don't think that's been appreciated enough in terms of what the president has done. We've just, speaking about reports, we issued one, Tim, what is it, yesterday on 10 lessons or goals for regulatory reform. And John Graham was kind enough to write the introduction. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but there's actually bipartisanship on that in the Senate. There's a bipartisan caucus that we're working with that is Johnson and it's Rounds, and the governors are very interesting because they deal with it a lot, and King and Manchin.
So it actually, just the one thing to follow up, one last thing on this too, to circle back into what you said, because you said report, that we at CEA put out a study on the impact of regulation and deregulation on growth. And going back to the Paris meeting that DJ and I were just attending, this is not controversial stuff. That the OECD basically has pillars that they recommend that OECD nations pursue in order to go for growth. And infrastructure reform, tax reform, and deregulation, are right there in the center. And if you look at OECD measures of, how costly regulations are in the U.S., we're, way down at the bottom of OECD nations. We've got a lot of potential ground that we can make on growth if we pursue just the pillars that are widely accepted. And one would hope, given how wide the acceptance is of these things, that at some point we could go back to being a nation where people recognize that there's widespread agreement about what we can do to make our country better and pursue it on a bipartisan basis.
And I would encourage those of you who do not to really go to the CEA website, because I think Dr. Hassett is entirely right that is an organization which always attracts the best and the brightest from academia. I mean, Richard, wasn't Larry Summers working for Marty Feldstein, or do
And
I
Paul
have it wrong?
Krugman, they were both there at the same time.
Yeah,
That's right.
so those are the best economists of really objective, solid work, which is not politicized. Who wants to jump in next? Aha, we've got the media, and we've got a scholar here. You are.
Oh yeah, wait for the mic, please.
Bob Davis, American Bankers Association. You've alluded a couple times to the impact of tax reform and other economic policies on the international side. Sometimes when you read commentary, you think international is all about bilateral and multilateral negotiations. But could you comment a little bit on the impact of economic policy that will really change what those negotiations are about? I don't want to suggest that economics makes agreements irrelevant, but it certainly will change what goes on in those negotiations.
I'm not a person who is involved with negotiations, except maybe with my teenage son, and I seem to always lose those. But I think that you're right that economics has a big impact on the setting within which negotiations happen. And this is something that I have been talking about and spoke about at the Tax Policy Center and Tax Foundation event. That as an example, this tax reform that could lower the rate and put guardrails around the corporate tax system so it's more of a territorial system, that it could potentially have a major impact on economic growth and also on the trade deficit. Because there's a National Bureau of Economic Research study that came out in the spring also has two co-authors who are at the BEA. It's just kind of a national treasure, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, where they estimated that transfer pricing by U.S. multinationals about doubles the U.S. trade deficit. And so instead of making stuff here, you make it in Ireland, you pay too much for it, you move the income to Ireland, you import it back into the U.S., that's the game that people do to avoid taxes. It's a hard game for our friends from Boeing to play, because they have like just one really, a lot of production here in the U.S. But if we get the rate down, then there's going to be a lot less of that activity, and you wonder, well, how important could that be for thinking about the trade deficit? Well, the trade deficit's about doubled because of transfer pricing. If we reduce transfer pricing, it could go a long way towards improving the trade balance for the U.S. There are other effects, of course, with tax reform. So if we have a lower rate, then foreign companies might want to invest a lot in the U.S. We hope they do. But there are things that could move it in the other direction as well.
Who wants to jump in now? And let's go from the private sector to the media table. And you, ma'am, are?
I'm Lydia DePillis with CNN Money. And you mentioned infrastructure. President campaigned on infrastructure. Sounds like there's a plan somewhere in a filing cabinet. But this tax plan is projected to open up another $1 trillion worth of deficit. How do you propose that a substantial infrastructure plan would be financed in that environment?
Yeah, that's something that we'll have a lot more information on, and as the infrastructure bill moves forward. I don't have details of an infrastructure bill.
What we've got, I mean, this is just one piece of the economic package, and I think we're all concerned about the deficit, and there's ways to deal with that also on the spending side. Who wants to jump in next? Let's just do one more media, the nice lady there.
Thanks. Jean Nuchon with Reuters Breaking Views. You've talked about the corporate tax rate cut and the effects of that on average wages for household income going up about at least $4,000. But in recent earnings calls from CEOs, they've talked about using any of the effects of that and additional profits to return capital to shareholders, whether it's in the form of buybacks and dividends. The latest Business Roundtable survey also showed that CEOs don't actually expect a big surge in hiring, which is also another thing that the White House has talked about in terms of the corporate rate cut and possibly a jobs hiring spree. So I wanted to just get your thoughts on, how you sort of reconcile those thoughts from CEOs and what they're thinking about in reality, and sort of your projections of what the effects could be. Thank you.
Sure, thanks. This goes back to, there are surveys back even when I was in grad school that ask CFOs, hey, if we change taxes, what are you going to do? And the surveys of CFOs very often have found that CFOs report that they don't pay much attention to taxes, that they're going to make their decisions based on other factors, and taxes won't affect their activity. And that's something that's inconsistent with their actual actions. So that if you look at how tax policy has impacted things like capital formation over time, there's a massive literature, and one of my early pieces co-authored with Glenn Hubbard is the Brookings papers that looks at how we should think about how capital formation responds to taxes. And in the data, you can see that they do respond quite a bit. But when you ask them, they very often sort of imply that they don't, which is kind of a puzzle to economists. I think that if you ran a business and I ran a business, and suppose that we changed the tax code so that it was a lot cheaper to run your business one way, like with machines, and you responded and I didn't, then you'd put me out of business. And I think they have to logically respond if they're pursuing their fiduciary duty to their shareholders. And I think that the key channel, though, is right at this moment the capital investment. That right now we locate a factory in Ireland, we move the money to Ireland, and create the jobs in Ireland and avoid the U.S. tax. So that's the system that we have in the world after the tax bill. Then the incentive to do that is going to be radically reduced, and we expect that that's going to induce firms, as we see even, in fact, I think the Business Roundtable CEOs put out a statement about how they would be doing this, that it would induce firms to invest in the U.S. and to form capital. And I think that's something that you guys have been writing about since before I started writing about it.
And Arnold Harburger, is still on our board in terms of some of those preliminary investigations. Sure. I'm very sensitive of the chairman's time. He's been so generous. He's giving us a little more time. I think we're going to go another 11 minutes. So jump in. Who wants to? This is Richard, the first executive director of the ACCF. Richard.
Hi, Richard. Hi, Kevin. Use the mic.
Pardon me?
Use the microphone.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. My colleague Dan Mitchell and I, for almost 20 years now, have been fighting the OECD. You mentioned your role there. And I realize the economic shop is totally different than the tax shop. And what we've been fighting is the OECD effort to stop what they call harmful tax competition. Now, many of us think tax competition is a very fine thing and ought to be encouraged. And it's not so much a question, but I would just encourage you, when you're over there, to try to put your foot on those folks.
Put my foot on those folks. I think that you're right that tax competition has moved tax policy around the world towards optimal tax design. And that one of the risks of international bodies in terms of risks for the world's citizens is that they would form like a policy cartel that protected countries against competition from other countries that have better policies. And I know that the sort of tax harmonization crowd is pursuing an objective that's not economically optimal, and that's something that you and Dan have been writing about for a long time. I think that the OECD has a really large staff of incredibly talented PhD economists, and they do a lot of great work that I think has value for places like the U.S. or other members of the OECD, because they aren't really partisan, right? And so right now, we were just discussing the wage effect, and I know there's some people say, oh, the wage effect's much smaller than Kevin says, and then having another place where you can go look and see, well, what does the OECD say about what a country ought to do to get more growth, or they ought to have a tax reform, they ought to invest in infrastructure, they ought to deregulate, and you can even use the OECD numbers to say, well, what if the U.S. had regulatory costs that were comparable to the Netherlands? Turns out the Netherlands does it pretty rationally. Then how much growth would you get? And so I think that's a pretty valuable resource for the economic community. And I don't think that, though, that when you have a lot of talented, smart people working on stuff, that you're going to agree with every study, right? But having a resource like that is something that I think I celebrate.
And we have got the gentleman there with the white hair and tie, distinguished. You are?
Good morning. Mike Roman, ExxonMobil. I guess no forum like this would be complete without a question on energy. And energy, obviously, with a lot of help from the administration, is becoming a big factor in U.S. economic growth. And hopefully we can continue to be the reliable, affordable, secure supplier of energy that we are now and going forward. In order to make that happen, there are supply chains, and one of the biggest ones is the North American supply chain. And I'm just wondering, has there been any discussion about the factor of energy in the NAFTA negotiations and making sure that a strong NAFTA stays in place in order to allow those energy markets to continue to be able to grow, expand, and add value to the U.S. economy?
I'm not participating in the NAFTA negotiations. I know everybody's, there is an administration official who's acutely aware of how energy supply chains work, right, the cabinet member. But if you have questions about what's going on in the NAFTA negotiations, I'd ask you to address Bob Lighthizer. He's the one who's managing that.
Rich Powell.
I'll take another stab at energy that might be closer to the mark. Rich Powell from the Clear Path Foundation. Part of the economic resurgence of the United States is obviously driven by this disruptive change we've had in domestic energy supply, driven in part by public sector spending on energy innovation. And I wonder what your view is on continuing those good times with further deep public sector support for the sector.
I've not been involved in discussions of changes in public sector attitude towards this. I think that it's obvious that there's been a revolution in the energy sector that's been really good for the U.S. economy, and that if you just look at the data and the output data, you can see that there's a lot of good stuff happening, and that it's the intent of everybody that is in that part of the cabinet to make those factors continue. But I've not been specifically involved in the conversation about that.
One of the, to me, intellectually intriguing challenges is, you remember the debate about who created that? And the president at that time said, well, you need roads and all of that. And people on the right said, well, wait a minute, you need entrepreneurship. And then the question becomes, well, who created the computer? And I understand it wasn't Al Gore, but DARPA played a role. Sure. And you've got ARPA-E, which provides the lab. So obviously we don't want a Solyndra, but I think a conservative case can be made for some public role in NIH or energy and that. Have you given that some thought?
Well, it's not, so this is just Kevin,
yes,
the economist, but I've certainly written about this over the years, and there is a lot of research that suggests that R&D spending has a big positive external effect, and the idea is that if I discover something, then it helps somebody else discover something. But the value of the secondary discovery won't go 100% to me, because it's like I wrote about this and then I gave you the idea and then you wrote about something even better. And so that so when the social return to something is a lot higher than the private return, then that's an argument for subsidies and things like that. And I've definitely written a lot about that over the years.
Okay, who has something Yes, let's go to somebody who hasn't asked a question yet. I can call on you if you'd like. No, I won't do
There's
that.
somebody over here.
Oh, I'm sorry. Forgive me. Could you identify yourself?
David Isaacs with the Semiconductor Industry Association. And the question I was going to ask was just the topic that was being discussed was the importance of federal investments in basic research. You know, our industry invests on average 20% of revenue into R&D, among the highest of any sector. But we very much rely on federal investments in basic research at universities and national labs, and we think that that has helped our technology leadership, our national security, and importantly, it builds the pipeline of talent that then we can hire. So just want to get your thoughts on your thoughts and the administration's thinking on maintaining those investments as we're heading into debates on the budget.
Sure. Well, I think that you know, my role at CEA is to provide objective analysis and talk about the economics of things. And you know, what I can say is that you know, if asked to analyze, or when we are asked to analyze, then you know, I think our analysis shows what you know is in the literature, that there's a big gain to the U.S. From our thought leadership that is centered on, you know, the universities and the centers of learning. And so I'm sure that would be a major factor in people's thinking as they move forward and think about, you know, budget issues next year.
It's almost the closing time. Who wants to do the finale question? If not, oh, I'm sorry, sir. Your name?
I'm Chris Hassler with Synthetics, a small firm here in D.C. I'm interested in how you see the repatriation of earnings and how they will be applied as a stimulus.
Sure. Thanks. You know, there was a, I guess, CRS report that looked at the last repatriation holiday and found that it didn't do much to stimulate investment. And I think that that's something that an economist or, you know, a person at ACCF would, anyone would have anticipated, because they didn't really change the corporate tax code. They didn't change the user cost of capital. They didn't do anything to make people want to invest in the U.S. They just gave them a chance to bring the money home. The firms that were bringing the money home had a lot of money, right? That's why they were bringing the money. They had money to bring home, and so they weren't. It's not like they didn't have access to capital markets and couldn't invest in the U.S. because the money was somewhere else. I think that the big difference now is that we are making the U.S. a competitive country again. And so when you're thinking about, well, where's all that capital formation going to come from? You know, the economic models that find that you don't get much growth from this tax plan, I'll say that there's all this crowding out, that we can only fund the capital in the U.S. if people save more, and savings elasticities are kind of small and stuff like that. And I think the reason why that analysis is not, you know, helpful at the current time for understanding what's going to happen is that there's all this cash that can be used to finance capital spending here. There's all this transfer pricing that can be slowed, which could fund capital formation here. And so the capital spending spike that one would expect to see beginning next year is something that it's easy to envision how to finance. In our CEA economic report on the growth effects of the corporate side of the tax bill, we go into these channels in a great deal of detail, and it's very, again, easy to think about how the capital spending boom that we expect in the U.S. Can be financed, in part because this money is over there. But it is true that the last time they had a holiday, it didn't do much for capital spending, and I think that economic theory, you know, explains why.
Which is very, very interesting, because we were involved, Alan Sinai did an analysis the last time, and a lot of members of Congress said, you know, it didn't work, and I think you explained why it didn't. So to conclude, you certainly got the highest honors at Swarthmore, deservedly.
No, just high, not
high. High, okay. I assure you I didn't get high.
In college, yeah.
I might have had a chance if you were teaching there. Probably not, because it would have been a good course, but my intellect still wouldn't have improved. When Kevin was nominated to the CEA, there were academics both on the right and the left who congratulated and were so pleased that he was nominated. These were policymakers in Democratic and Republican administrations and some of the best economists. I think you can see why Truman was right. We need a two-handed economist, but we have one here, which I think helps the process along. And finally, I'd like to say that I think the country, and we're also lucky to have you at the CEA, and please join me in a round of applause for the 29th
Thank you
chairman.
very much. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really.
Thank you.